6, 2024. We are recording and transcribing, so thank you in advance for joining us in speaking slowly and clearly. And I'm going to, in a moment, paste an agenda in the chat. While we are working on that, I want to ask if anybody on the council has seen the agenda and wants to make any additions or changes to it.
All good here.
All right.
I have a slide for it. You want me to put it on screen?
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
All right, let me do that. Presenting in Teams. Present. Let me know when you all can see this.
Okay, we can see.
Okay.
So we'll
Cool.
be starting with a walkthrough of some bills, then moving to next year's annual report. We'll talk about some legislative prioritization, get into some other business, which who knows what that could be, and then some public comment. And actually, one thing that I would like to do is before we get started with our first agenda item, I do want to open up one round of public comment. If there's anybody here not on the council who wants to address the council but doesn't want to stay for the whole meeting, please feel free to do so now. We'll give another opportunity at the end if you'd like to comment on today's discussion as well. All right. Well, you know where to find us. We'll also be watching the chat if you prefer to chat your comments. Just a quick Teams tip for folks. We're probably going to be doing a lot of screen sharing today. If you'd like to toggle between seeing the shared content big versus seeing people's faces big, you can just click on someone's face and it should switch it so that you can see the grid larger than you can see the shared content. So in case you want to behold the beauty of the council, you can do that. I'm going to stop here and turn it back over to Josiah to begin us with our walkthrough.
Cool. So the reason that we wanted to start with the walkthrough is because I think it will help to frame the annual report, just to see kind of what's going on in the legislative space, both in Vermont's legislature and in other states. So I'm actually going to switch the share to the other way so that I can take notes as we're going along, if that works for everybody. Should have done that to begin with, but all right. So go ahead, Chris.
Just a quick procedural question before we dive into the substance. And thank you for the deep dive in the slides and circulating the draft language that you did. But is the council reflecting back on some of the prior meetings, one of the threshold questions I think for the report is whether or if the council recommends to lawmakers that the council take if not positions, come up with recommendations on legislation or policy. So has the council come to a firm conclusion on that one way or the other?
No, I don't think so, but we were thinking it would be helpful to see kind of the landscape of what kinds of things we might be asked to weigh in on in order to answer that question of do we want to say yes, we want to weigh in on those kinds of things.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, it was a little unclear to me, like in some ways it's good to know like the landscape and that's really what the discussion is, but not so much that the council is necessarily trying to make decisions about whether or if to recommend or promote these particular proposals. So that's helpful context.
Right. Yep. So that's why we're starting with landscape, and then we'll go into the four things we've been asked to speak to, and then depending on where we land on that, we have a spot to go back and dive into these and provide input on them if the council would like to. So just starting off, I went through and did a survey of what other states have been doing in AI regulation over the last year. So this is statutes that are not kind of things that Vermont has already done. Lots of states are working on standing up councils and select committees and that type of thing. But kind of beyond that, there were three big areas that stood out from the NCSLA, the National Conference of State Legislatures, I think, in their tracking of all the things on all the walls in all the states and what the current status of those is. And the big one that most states have that the highest number of states have moved on is election-related AI content. There was a big push on that over the kind of middle of 24 to get things passed in that space. The second one is AI pornography, which the council did discuss back in, I think, March or April of this year. And then a subset of that, the child sex abuse material. And then the third thing is deep fake fraud. There's quite a few states that have proposed something like this, but I haven't seen much that's passed that's kind of talking about deep fakes comprehensively. But I did find one example just for the council to have a look at to see what's going on in that space. So that's those are the three big categories that states are looking at outside of Vermont. The other thing that I sent you all in the read ahead was 710 and 711 from last year with the kind of feedback that the council gave on those back in April or May. I can't remember which month it was. The feedback that the council gave on those for those two bills. So just quick kind of briefing on what is being covered by other states and the examples that I pulled in for you all to look at. The first one is pornographic content, and I'll just say, like, I'm going to talk for the next like 2 slides about pornography and stuff, so be aware of that. Pornographic content, if it's of a recognizable individual, you have to have permission in order to distribute it. That's kind of one trend, and that was in, I think, H710 last year. Child sex abuse material remains child sex abuse material, even if it's created with artificial intelligence. North Dakota passed kind of a very simple change that just changed the definition and expanded it to include AI generated content. There are other states that have done kind of much more extensive things around this, but that's another thing that lots of states are working on. The most comprehensive bill that I found on deep fakes broadly was from New Jersey, and I believe it's still pending. I think it's moved from one chamber to the other, but I don't think it's been passed. And that is a law around deceptive media, which looks at basically any kind of fake thing that you could make with technology. So it excludes things like where you have an actor involved, situations like that. It's relying on technical means, and they're focused on deceptive audio or visual media. And I can come back to this if the council wants to dive into it. Okay, go ahead, John.
Hey, Josiah, just one question of the rules that are on the books in other places. Is that for content generated within those states, or is it content that might be worldwide but is accessed by someone in the state? I'm just kind of curious about the enforceability.
Yeah, let me jump down. I did have a slide on it, which I wasn't going to get into yet, but I'll throw it on screen. It's the way that New Jersey did it is they created 2 crimes. One was deceptive media created with the intent of doing something, committing an offense or a crime or something like that. I can't remember the exact language. That was one crime that they created. So like merely creating it if it's part of an intent to do something else that's wrong. And then the other one is distributing material with an identifiable individual in it, or that purports to be from an identifiable individual without that individual's consent. So that covers things like general deep fakes, text deep fakes, and things like that. And it's if the victim was a resident of the state or if the perpetrator was a resident of the state is kind of how they have framed it.
That makes sense. Okay, thank you.
And we can dive into these in much more detail later if the council decides that they do want to weigh in on this type of material. The last two are things that were on the wall last year in Vermont, and legislature had conversations with me as the director about, but and we had a conversation, I think, here in this body, but there wasn't like a lot of work in committee on these, but I included them kind of for completeness. 710 was about algorithmic discrimination. We did spend some time reviewing this, so I'm not going to go into it in detail today, but it basically says that if you followed NIST standards or some other standard that has been approved, and the original statute had kind of very extensive language, which was something that the council had flagged as being potentially problematic, that you're okay, but you have to follow some kind of standard of mitigating the risk of algorithmic discrimination. And then the last one is basically it was a consumer protection law for the AI age that was on the wall. That was 711, and it basically said that liability starts with the person who actually deployed the AI system, but flows back to the whole chain of how that system was created. So those are kind of the flavor of statutes that are out there and that are currently pending. There are like other like specific statutes that states are looking at, things around facial recognition, around the use of things like drones, things like that. But trying to give a flavor of overall what's going on in the world of AI legislation right now. Any other questions on kind of that overview before the point of this was mainly to frame the conversation about, does the AI Council want to be involved in that type and prioritizing or suggesting or weighing in on these types of activities. So I wasn't going to dive into these at this point until the council determines whether or not we want to weigh in on those. But are there questions kind of overall at this point? Okay. So I'm gonna talk through the 2025 report. This is, I think we've gone through this the last couple of meetings that we've had. But just for a refresher, 2025 report of the council is supposed to focus on 4 questions. First one, whether the scope of the division should be expanded to include artificial intelligence outside state government. This would, if the council says yeah, that also expands the purview of the council, because the council's role is to give advice and oversight to the director of the division. So kind of expanding the scope of the division also expands the scope of the council. Second is whether there's any changes to the structural oversight, membership powers, or duties of the council itself. There is one duty of the council that is kind of not directly related to oversight and advice, and that's coordinating with the director on education of folks outside of state government about AI. So if there's any additional duties that the council should have. The third one is the end date for the council. Currently, that's put at 2027. And if there's any other tasks that should be assigned to the division. So I'm proposing that we talk through these, kind of looking at the first one and then the fourth one, because those really focus on the division, and then go on to the second and third one as they're more focused on the council. So, and then this is the part where I want lots of input. So I've put together a few questions to start the conversation. So I guess first one was, do we think there needs to be AI regulation? I've heard I feel like unanimous, yeah, there needs to be something from all of the counselors. But I think we haven't had real consensus on if statute enacted by legislature is sufficient or if we need something beyond that, and if so, whether that should be the division or some other body. So I guess that's where I'll open it up, and then we can take the conversation wherever y'all want to take it. John, you still have a hand up, which I guess means you get to go first if you want to.
Sorry, that's from before.
Okay.
Well, it's a great question, Josiah. I guess, one question I have for the group, and I think I've relayed this before, I think there are questions about the members of the council vis-a-vis our respective roles. And I'm still a little concerned about the potential for conflicts among various agencies that may come to different conclusions about various aspects of legislative or regulatory fixes. The council is a great body to, receive all kinds of information from all sorts of parties and perspectives, but should it get to a place where it's actually making recommendations as a body that is in support of certain legislation or regulation, I guess there might be a question of, the independence of the agencies and its participants, and whether or if we serve on the council in a formal way, and whether or if that implicates any agency and any position that agency as an independent actor may wish to take vis-a-vis legislation. So that's just an interesting question or concern I wanted to flag for the group.
Chris, do you have an opinion on that? I know it's framed as a question, but do you have thoughts about how the participation of a particular agency impacts its ability to take a stand in the legislature?
I don't think it impacts. I think every agency and every body retains its own independent authority. And certainly, we all answer to different directors or independently elected officials. So I would never take the position that a body cedes its authority. I think the question is just more when or if a conflict might arise, what does that mean? Does it mean that a council member has to recuse themselves or has to vote no affirmatively? Or does that mean that simply electing not to vote is the remedy there? I think there's some distinctions to be made between law enforcement agencies and enforcement powers that we retain and that we have an obligation and duty to execute. Potential for conflict with other laws, like we have a Consumer Protection Act that protects against unfair and deceptive acts and practices. Arguably, any artificial intelligence entity that is currently operating that does something unfair or deceptive is in violation of existing law. So one question is, we already have a very broad law that says setting aside the particulars or the granular details of artificial intelligence in and of itself, if you're perpetrating any of these crimes or doing something deceptive with somebody else's data. By the way, there might be a privacy law that comes into play too, which requires consumer consent. So that's sort of separate and apart from artificial intelligence. But anyway, so there's a question of conflict of laws, potential for conflicts of interest. And so those are all just concerns that I have about expanding the scope of the division or putting the council in a position where it is supposed to be the vehicle that gives an imprimatur of legitimacy on a particular legislative priority where other agencies or actors may have a strong difference of opinion on those, or it may not be a difference of opinion as to the goal, but it may be as to the structure or implementation. So it gets complicated quickly.
Hi, this is Jake Durrell. I'm just wondering, wouldn't they have an opportunity? I mean, just like we have, there's 2 comment periods in this meeting today, to provide input, to ensure that we avoid those inconsistencies, and if there was some kind of, notice about the potential conflicts in law, that maybe those issues could be avoided. I mean, there's already an authority for the council to facilitate the division's advice to the General Assembly on internal systems. And I think that is being balanced well. There's the same potentials for conflicts there. But it's just those systems are kind of intertwined. Like some of the proposed legislation, there might be internal systems which don't necessarily themselves use artificial intelligence, but that they regulate external systems that do. So doesn't that fall within the existing statute already as an appropriate action for the council to advise on?
Yeah, it's a good question about whether there's, already potential for internal. I think all council members, rightly have an opportunity to express themselves. I think if there's a report that's issued or a legislative recommendation, then I think that the question could arise if the council has ratified that. Do council members need to be especially wary and mindful of either voting no if they have a disagreement, and then how does that manifest? Like, does an agency have to write a minority report expressing all the reasons why it said no, and that it takes a countervailing opinion on a particular aspect? If it's going to be public facing, I think there is a distinction there between, legislation that's going to affect all Vermonters versus internal regulatory use of AI, which is primarily an ADS determination, at least vis-a-vis state agencies. Independently elected branches may have their own internal policies about how they're going to treat that, that presumably be consistent with both ADS, but they may have their own, policies and procedures for implementing depending on their own process. But, we're really talking about public policy versus internal governance, and I do think those are distinct and different.
So, Chris, to summarize what I think I heard you say, as the like your opinion part of that, agents like an agency wouldn't be bound to support the council's recommendations simply because they had a member on the council. I think I heard you say like that's the standard practice and would be a good I guess a good thing to clarify for this council as well.
Yeah, and I think so. And I guess, I'm just naturally more cautious or conservative in this area. So, and I realize obviously this is a response the council is going to make. Lawmakers are ultimately going to decide, but whether the scope of the division should grow to essentially occupy a space that's issuing directives or recommendations vis-a-vis public policy writ large, as opposed to internal policy. As the state that's a very significant change, and I can't pretend I don't have a directive from the Attorney General on that, but I just my instinct is to be naturally cautious or more conservative in that realm, and I'll certainly report back if and when it comes to a vote about the position our office would take on that. But
so apart from the position of your office or maybe because you are constrained by the position of your office, like, are you feeling like the scope should not include taking a position on legislation, or is your preference that in that direction, or not prepared to comment on that yet?
Yeah, I don't think I can comment on that yet.
Okay.
Like I said, I think my instinct is to be cautious and conservative, that an expansion to any agency of state government is a significant departure. So that raises all kinds of, I don't even know if the council is frankly best positioned to like make that determination or even make a recommendation in that area. But because the other question, of course, is what are the implications for other commercial enterprise that may come into contact with AI, right? And sort of like what is the constraint or the box within which the division would be operating, not just the council, but because the council's role would necessarily change, but also the division itself. Like, is that hard stop at just AI, or is it anything that touches AI? There could
And
be
I
a
think
range
that's
of
what the legislature has asked us to weigh in on for this year.
Yeah. Not a simple question.
Nope. Others, do you have thoughts on this?
I was just gonna ask if there is any,
You're super quiet, Jess.
oh, I'm sorry. I'm gonna yell. I don't know why I got a new computer and the mic doesn't work for some reason.
Should talk to ADS about that.
Yeah, I know. I was just gonna say, can we think of are there any councils we might be able to look at in terms of precedent where this kind of relationship already exists to, like, what we're doing now? And then if we were to expand scope in the future, like, I don't know, is there another body that acts similarly, or is there like a model for what we might be contemplating? Because I'm just thinking, I can't really think of like another council or another body that is advisory and then some. Do you know what I mean? So I
Todd, are
can't
there
think of
any?
anything off the top of my head, but I didn't know if for others on the call, if there was something that already existed within your kind of realms or your departments, agencies, that kind of thing that you work with or something. I don't know. But I can't really I can't think of an example.
I'm wondering if there's anything from Human Services land. And I know, like Amanda and Todd, you've both had some experience over in that side of the world.
I'm happy to jump in, but I will follow Susanna's directive on the counselor speaking when I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, go ahead, John.
I was just wondering if environmental is an example, like if a, economic development says, hey, we're going to go do this. There's an potential environmental issue. How does that get handled? Or any other transport, let's say transportation and environmental. How are those two things worked out? I mean, is there a precedent there that we would follow?
Well, I missed the first part, John. I apologize. I forget the very first part of what you said, the example that you asked for. What did you say? Transportation board?
Environmental, I think.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was saying, yeah, that if environmental, if there's some environmental like Act 250 implication of something that transportation wanted to do. I was just wondering if there's anything we could learn by how those departments, I mean, what triggers review and how are conflicts resolved?
I don't know about environmental specifically. Um, yeah, I don't know if
Yeah,
anybody
I
else
mean,
knows.
I think in both of those examples, and again, I think I'm getting a little bit over my skis here, but like in both of those examples, working with the transportation board and then working with, say, the natural resources board, or what was formerly the natural resources board, I do feel like those, even those are regulatory in nature from the get-go, right? Like they have, maybe rulemaking authority. Like I think like just generally they're set up a little bit differently. All of their counselors are not volunteer, right? Though they're or appointed, or the executive director. I think the lead of those two are appointed. But regardless, I think we don't really have any of that authority necessarily. Rulemaking, regulatory, that kind of thing.
So I'm hearing we're not set up to be a regulatory entity as we're constructed today.
As we're constructed right now, yes. And that's what yeah.
Go ahead, Amanda.
I was gonna say something very similar to Jessica's, that Eddie, and I also don't know that ADS in its inception was meant to have a purview outside of state governance with regulation. So I'm not taking an opinion for and against. I think it should just be carefully planned if that's the decision, and making sure it's very clear from the get-go, because that would be a departure from like existing business. And would make sure to be clear about implications and long-term impacts of those choices. And having the governance and things clear from the beginning, I think will be extremely helpful for success or implementation.
Over to you, Mr. Todd. But you're muted.
Helpful to unmute. Mostly just going to agree with what Jessica and Amanda just said, that part of the distinction I would draw between certainly AOT, but also the work ANR does, is that they've always had a statewide purview in both the regulatory space and the enforcement spaces, and AOT less so in enforcement, but of course, they've got DMV and the like. And I think the challenge of moving from an internal service organization like ADS to an external policy shaping body is a pretty significant one. I think that's part of what Chris was flagging there. And I would just also highlight, the Commission on Women, Building Bright Futures, a lot of those are heterogeneous appointment bodies that sit outside of state government. They may rely on a quasi-state entity. Another example could be, the Human Rights Commission is a little different, but there are other examples out there of bodies that are created solely to either develop policy or enforce the law. And we're sort of like imagining, and what the legislature seems to have asked here is like, can this body, the council, opine on expanding the work of the division, which has expertise, but expertise that's largely been inwardly focused? And I would suggest that there's a lot more transition that would need to happen. And it's possible that part of that evolution could be what Chris flagged in the chat, namely that clearinghouse model, that study group, work group kind of model for a while, where the expertise of the technologists at ADS, the users from the public and other technological experts in the public, and then the rest of us in state government, including the enforcement arm at the AGO, but also ACCD and AHS, could weigh in on that as an interim step to something down the line that could be policy shape and development. But I can't think of any example where there is a body that's sort of like, hey, you're going to be the voice of the entire state government, the executive branch of state government, as multifaceted as it is, to speak with one voice on a policy position. I think that is inherently a pretty challenging place to sit.
So I'm trying to think about how to draft something to answer this first question. And I think I've heard from the majority of the council that or at least the majority of people who have spoken so far, that like we can't answer this question at this point. Like we not like we don't. Yeah, the council members individually aren't able to give an answer to this question from inside yet. So I'm trying to think, maybe the phrasing of it is something like the council doesn't have an opinion one way or the other on this yet, but if we were to expand the scope to outside state government, it would be a multi-year path to doing it, and we'd flow through several intermediate steps and need to kind of push the council a little bit, like make it step away from state government to be a little bit more like one of those independent organizations in order for it to really serve some of this role. Is that a statement that people can agree with?
Can you say it again, Josiah? I mean,
That's
if
the
you
hard
netted
part.
that out, it sounded a little, I mean, I know it has to be vague, but it sounded specific, intentionally vague. Could you restate it?
I'm trying to put it on the slide. So just give me a second. Something like that. And I can read it if that helps. I guess I probably should read it because I know some people are on the phone. So the council doesn't really have an opinion yet on this. If the division did expand outside state government, it would be a multi-year process. The composition of the council would have to change a bit, and overall, the council would have to kind of step a little bit away from being a part of kind of the state government operations and become a little bit more of an independent organization in order for it to be effective at that point.
I think with a multi-year process, it will be helpful for us to be, or for the state to be open to and willing to continually revisit the original purpose and the current landscape, because over the course of just a few short years, so much can change, including who are the players on the board in Vermont, and and what are the different issues that are going to be coming up. So I do think if we were looking at a multi-year process, then we'd want to have some kind of fidelity to sort of the original goal, but also be very willing to adapt to a changing landscape that may look different by the end of that multi-year process than it did at the beginning of it.
Recognizing the conversation happening in the chat. A determination at this time is premature. However, a clearinghouse model could be an aid to policymakers in the short term. And then, Chris, I'm just going to paste this into the comments of this rather than keep that, rather than read all that out loud. And then, thank you. And then Jess, as we exist and function now, we wouldn't support having a scope outside of state government. Asking if that's where the council stands right now.
In some ways, I like Jessica's just because it's more direct, and I think sometimes lawmakers appreciate a direct response.
Any other wise opinions on this? Otherwise, this is what I'm going to work on for language for our report. Okay. Oh, go ahead, John.
So I was just thinking about what you just said, or paraphrasing Jess. So are we suggesting that we haven't reached that conclusion, or that we're leaning against extending?
I think extending is a question we haven't gotten to yet. Go ahead, Susanna.
I was going to say, to me, it almost sounds like both, just kind of reading the room, but I might be misreading the room.
There's an awkward pause here. All right, I'm gonna go on to the next question. And if anybody wants me to come back, I'll come back, and you'll get another chance to look at language later. All right. Additional tasks for the division. Knowing that we've now said the scope is not expanding beyond state government at this instant. It might in the future, but it isn't today. These are the current powers and duties. Reviewing artificial intelligence systems deployed, developed, employed, or procured in state government, proposing a code of ethics and doing annual updates, making recommendations to the General Assembly on policies, laws, and regulations for AI systems in state government, and reviewing the inventory of AI tools that ADS creates. Those are currently the divisions for activities. Obviously, ADS has other things than that, like actually going and implementing AI. Are there any other homework assignments that you want to give the division, or you want the legislature to give the division?
Do you think it would be helpful to put and kind of clarify under review, like coming up with like a state process for working with the division on those state, procurements, and just like a more governed and clear process on how you do that?
It could. I also think that can be, like, ADS generally has procurement oversight, so that can be a thing that just falls under the fact that the division sits within ADS. Chris, you said number 4. Oh, you're saying this point, like the current duties and powers are the right duties and powers. Thanks.
One thing that's not in here that is sort of, I would hope, implicit, but it's not stated outright. And our office has struggled with a lot of people in state government who have been inexplicably opposed to it, is community engagement. So I know that through each of these bulleted items, that can be incorporated into all of these, but I would like to see it said somewhere because my experience has been that if it's not the law that you have to talk to the public, we do have several entities of state government who just don't want to talk to the public. Um, they're not interested in ceding or sharing power. They're not interested in community consultation. And it makes it really difficult for us to establish a trusting relationship with communities and to know what genuinely is happening with them and how our work is impacting them. So it doesn't necessarily, I mean, I'm open to many different ways to include that, but I would like to see it somewhere on paper that this is an expectation.
I wrote it down. It'll go in if no one has opposition. Um, any others? Yep, community engagement typically takes resources, and legislature did give a whole position to the division, so. But it's a good point.
Yeah, no, I agree with that point. And I think it's important that the legislature, because it's, I mean, I have occasionally also seen them encourage state offices to do engagement. And it doesn't carry any kind of support for that. So it's unrealistic, I think, for us to be expected to do it in a meaningful way without that support. So I think we should be pushing ourselves to do the engagement, but pushing them to properly resource it.
Yep. And to be clear, I was saying that one position is probably not sufficient in order to actually meaningfully do that work. Okay. Anything else on this slide before I move to the question of the longevity of the council?
Josiah, one question I have is, we were talking about civic engagement, which I think is a really good idea. What about cross-divisional engagement in the government? I mean, as AI evolves, presumably this group would be on the vanguard of understanding new issues, potential problems, et cetera. Is there something that we need to say that the role that this organization would play in educating the other divisions? Is that part of our purview going forward?
It's a good question. I think it's been kind of happening, I think reasonably effectively, although people in divisions that are not ADS can weigh in on whether that's being effective or not. But it is certainly something that could be made more explicit. Okay. I'm going to jump to the longevity of the council. Earlier this year, when we talked about this one, I think someone had tossed around the idea of extending it out several years, just because the landscape keeps evolving very rapidly. It's hard to put we certainly won't need it again by 2027 in place, and it's also hard to say that we need it forever. So I think there was someone earlier that had suggested 2030 as an end date. But what do we think about longevity of the council? Does that still seem right, or is there another date that we should use, or should this also be we'll address it next year in our 26 report? Where are folks at with that?
One thought I had about this, Josiah, is out of respect to future legislatures, which obviously don't have the opportunity to weigh in on extensions, is to perhaps note and suggest that there could be an ongoing 2-year process, and that barring action from future legislatures. There would be sort of an automatic renewal provision that's the presumption, but that the terms of the council are essentially 2 years in duration, with an option for an automatic renewal, and that provides a little bit of deference to future legislatures that may wish to wade into this and opine on whether it's still necessary. It also gives the council an opportunity to say, after 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 or 10 years, things have changed, and so a pivot is needed, and maybe this body is no longer the appropriate one. There's other, who knows, by that time there could be a federal regulatory agency on point that handles all of this, and we could be preempted essentially. Or there could be, all kinds of, like you said, all kinds of things could happen in the future. So the council itself might come to a different conclusion, or lawmakers might, but it could be a nice nod to say, we're not saying it should cease, but there should be like essentially 2-year terms for the council going forward. And then lawmakers can just decide if they don't take any action, then the presumption is it just renews automatically. That could be one construct that kind of gets at that. Things could potentially change, but absent a change, maybe the work of the council is important enough to be ongoing. But we're not trying to usurp a future legislature and their ability to weigh in.
I could support that. I think that makes sense.
Is that
I
a good,
actually- Oh,
oh,
I was
sorry, go
gonna-
ahead, Jess.
Oh, I was just gonna say, actually, I think I feel a little bit differently about it than Chris, and I just want to weigh in because the agency does kind of not manage, but the Economic Progress Council is kind of set up like this, and it can feel very chaotic every 2 years to have the conversation about whether or not it's relevant to continue on. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but it does just add another layer of kind of management to what we do. And I don't know. And I would think that if, a future legislature, if we are submitting annual reports and future legislatures think that the council should be dissolved, or we think that the council should be dissolved, we have the ability to say that, or the ability to kind of initiate that. But it can, just coming a little bit from experience, it can definitely feel chaotic every 2 years when we have to have these conversations about relevancy. And
does VEPSI have is it automatically renewed if the issue does not surface, or is it required that?
Yeah, so I guess it used to be, is my understanding. But now it is just, so I feel like it used to be, and then the legislature, like, I don't know. It used to be, and now we're having the conversation every 2 years about whether or not it should still exist and whether or not that group should still have authority. So they actually changed it from just being automatically renewed to just a 2-year cycle. But again, I think we would still, in the scenario that you're talking about, Chris, we would still be responsible for going to the legislature and discussing relevancy every 2 years, because or it would just continue on, right? Like, wouldn't it be our responsibility to say, hey, by the way, this exists in statute. If you guys don't say anything, we just keep going. Here's what we've been up to.
Yeah, fair point, worth consideration.
What I was going to ask is about the membership. What organizations inside and outside our government are represented on the council, and the terms that people sit on the council. Should that be done on some sort of timeline, or should there be a process, or can that be left ad hoc?
What a great segue. I couldn't have asked for a better one. So the next question was the structure and powers of the council. There are a couple of gaps that we had identified over the last year of additional voices that we thought could be helpful to have on the council. And I think that's another piece of that. If what the term of a counselor is, because it was basically for the duration of the council initially. But obviously, if the council is going to continue indefinitely, then that's something that we'll need to address. I also want to recognize that we are at 3 o'clock. So, Susanna, I guess leave that to you if you want to keep going to finish this section up and talk about next steps, or if we need to cut it off.
Yeah, let me just poll the council members and ask, do we have the ability to stay on maybe until 3:10?
Unfortunately, I cannot, but I wouldn't. That's okay.
Okay. Thank you, John. I'm seeing a three who can. With respect to John, and we'll make sure that we capture any feedback that you might have after the meeting. Let's go on just for another 8 minutes until 3:10. I lied. Let's go on for 7 minutes because then we'll do a quick public comment. And we can make sure that everybody gets the notes afterwards.
Okay, we do have quorum until 3:10, so we're good. Okay. So yeah, the question here is the structure and powers of the council. John, do you want to talk about what you were just saying about the term of counselors, and if you have any specific ideas or opinions on that?
I didn't have any specific. I just think leaving it vague creates some tension that might not be necessary. You know, that people are elected for a 2-year. I think you could follow the same thing as people are elected for, say, a 2-year period and can be revisited at those 2-year periods, and otherwise cannot, opt to continue. I don't know, something like that. But leaving it unmentioned, I think, creates possible stress in the system later.
So the appointed members would serve for 2-year terms. Obviously, the ones that are particular role within state government or designee would be a little bit of a different story because those can change as the role changes.
Yeah. I was
Okay.
more thinking about representation of, like it would be, to my mind, it would be good to get more industry people in, even in an advisory role to the government. But that'll maybe become clearer as the AI application stuff evolves. So it's more of the makeup rather than the individuals.
Okay. Okay. So like wild card slots. Okay. And John, I know you said you had to bounce. So that's okay if you have to. Are you thinking like the council would say we need people from industry, governor or legislature or somebody appoint us 2 folks from industry to serve either in an advisory capacity or in an actual capacity on the council, and then 2 years later be like, we need more people from the arts community now, and we kind of evolve that. Is that does that construct make sense to the counselors? I know John dropped.
I have a concern about a public body like this providing formal seats on the council for industry. I think, industry is a key partner and has to be consulted, and we have a lot to learn. But I have some concerns about actually granting seats on the council to industry.
So
Can
it'd
I
be
add
like,
on to that?
yeah, go
Sorry,
for it.
Josiah, go ahead.
Nope.
I was going to say, can I add on to that? Even if I think it's a very fair point, and I think even if we were to add industry seats, I would hesitate. Should you say this? It's Friday, you should say it. I would hesitate to let elected officials be the ones to appoint them.
So maybe
It
it's
just feels
that
like
the,
there's too much opportunity there for, um, favoritism or s- stuff, stuff.
Well, it raises a good question about how to even decide if there's only a small number of seats on the council. Like, how could you there's so many interested
Mm-hmm,
parties. How could you possibly choose?
mm-hmm,
And so, then you're creating a construct where people who were left out are criticizing, and people who are in, like, are they only in for one term and then they automatically have to revolve and somebody new gets brought in, or do you lose that expertise? I just think it really is just terra firma to say the participants in the council are members of public bodies, and there's a certain amount of transparency and accountability there. Industry does not share that. And so I would want to avoid any questions from the public about influence. And then it just avoids the kinds of questions that Susanna was just raising about how and who decides and for how long, and competition potentially to get onto the council among private industry? And are we only getting a certain slice um, or a certain perspective from certain actors for whatever period of time that they happen to serve? So just a lot of really tricky questions there that we might avoid by saying, yes, if the council, for example, wants to create a subcommittee that's composed entirely of industry, but that has no voting rights and has no applicability, like that could be a body of like 50 people who are chatting, quarterly, and then providing information to the council. Like that might be great because it would just give us a whole bunch of information to sort of pick and choose from. Um, and it could be open to any and all who want to sort of play in that sandbox. But it just takes us out of that sort of more formal, quote, advisory role that the council plays. So I would have some concerns about that.
so maybe the ability to create subcommittees, including with non-council members. Maybe is that where we're leaning as a potential change?
Yeah, I would say subcommittees, stakeholder groups, or other information providers. There might be a range, again, without having really thought it through, I don't know what it means if there's a quote formal subcommittee. Obviously, almost every council or task force that I've ever been a part of holds, some kind of public hearing or invites stakeholders to meaningfully participate, and that can be done through questionnaires, requests for written submissions, regular meetings. There's just a wide variety. So I wouldn't want to just peg it all to like it has to be a subcommittee. There could be a robust and wide variety of ways to engage private industry that could be really beneficial to this group for sure. Because I don't think anybody on this body pretends we have all the answers. So um, and I think that that's kind of a welcome mat too for those industries to say like, hey, we do want to hear from you. We're not closed to that.
Okay.
I'm gonna
Go ahead,
pop
Susanna.
in. Sorry, I keep interrupting you, Josiah, but I'm gonna pop in. We're at 3:10. So if we want to do a quick wrap up and invite any non-council members who have anything to add, if they want to jump in real quick.
Yeah, so for wrap up, I was just gonna say, if it's okay, I'd like to tap Jess to help write the things with me. And then we
Sure.
can, okay, thank you. And then we could bring this back to the council. Are folks open to having a session on Friday to review language, next Friday, in other words? Is that doable, or the one after?
Next Friday at this time works for me.
I can do that part over email. I can do scheduling over email. I'm capable of doing that. So I'll tentatively shoot for this time next Friday. Um, Sounds good. And Susanna, over to you for public comment.
Public, over to you for public comment.
Todd, you want to be our public? Any comments? Jake?
Come on, Todd, we know you want to.
I already said my thing. I'm 10 minutes late to talk about harassment.
Oh. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.